So this is part 3 of the unit circle. If we were in class, we would be doing the directions here. It really works with colors. I'll try to use those colors on the next page. It's really fine to do what's on the next page. So if you want to read through this, you can, but we're going to move over to the homework page. So this is the homework, but we're doing it here because we don't have the activity. If you look at number 1, it says that we want to finish, whatever we were doing for the activity. We can kind of ignore that. We're just going to scroll up. So this is our full unit circle diagram. Just zoom it up. Okay. Hopefully we can see most of it here. I'm going to scroll up just a little bit more so that I can see the whole thing in the middle of my video. So working through this, the first thing I'm going to do is all of the degree measures. Now, ideally, you know the degrees. You don't need to listen to me if you want to kind of forward the video, but I'm going to go through everything in this video so we have it all together. So first I'm going to start out with the quadrantal angles. So 0, 90, 180, and this is just adding 90 around the circle for all of the right angles, and then 360. I'm going to work on all of my angles related to 30 degrees next. So this is just a fact that you need to know. That first angle is 30. Here, 180 minus 30 is 150, 180 plus 30 is 210, and 360 minus 30, working down this way, is 330. Okay. Then all my angles that work with 45, also something to memorize, that the second angle is 45. 180 minus 45, if we go up, is 135. 180 plus 35 is 225. And lastly, 360 minus 45 is 315. So there's many ways to do it. Remember, we're just working off the x-axis. Lastly, we have our angles related to 60. So this is 120, right? 180 minus 60, 180 plus 60 is 240. And then 360 minus 60 is 300. So that's all your degrees. And now we're going to move on to radians. Now there's many ways to do the radians. As I said, I'm just going to show the way I like to think through, but I might at the end after this show a couple other ways. So we're going to label full rotation. Half a rotation will be 1 pi. Cut that in half, and I have pi over 2. Remember, down here at the bottom, I have 1/2, 2 halves. So this is 3 halves pi, or 3 pi over 2. Okay. Now we're going to start working on the ones related to 60. Pi over 6. 1 pi minus a sixth is 5 pi over 6. 1 pi plus a sixth gives me 1 extra, so that's 7 pi over 6. 2 pi, which is equal to 12 pi over 6, minus a sixth would be 11 pi over 6. Using the same reasoning when we go to the 45s, this one is pi over 4, right? If I take 1 pi, which is 4/4 pi, and I subtract a quarter, I get 3 pi over 4. Add it on, get 5 pi over 4. And then 2 pi in fourths would be 8 pi over 4. Subtract 1 pi over 4, and we get 7 pi over 4. Lastly, we know 60 is pi over 3. Subtract it. 3 over 3 minus 1 over 3 is 2 over 3, 2 pi over 3. 3 over 3 for 1 plus 1 is 4 pi over 3. And then lastly, 2 pi in thirds would be 6 pi over 3. Minus 1/3 is 5 pi over 3. Now, just a couple comments. Some people hate this adding and subtracting method, which is totally fine. Some people just like to memorize them. Some people like to notice that in the second quadrant, all of my radian measures, I'm just trying to underline them, the numerator is 1 smaller than the denominator. So we have 2/3, 3/4, 5/6. In the third quadrant, the numerator is 1 bigger than the denominator, right? So 7, 6, 5, 4 is 4/3. And then in the fourth quadrant, all of my numerators are 1 less than double my denominator, which if you really think about what we're doing with adding, right, that should make sense that it works that way. So 11 is 1 smaller than 12, 7 is 1 smaller than 8, and 5 is 1 smaller than 6. So now we're going to move out to the points. We're going to start out and just label the points that are obvious, right? Our quadrantal angle points. Okay. So now we'll continue around, and I actually wanted to do those in green, so I'm going to pause that just to keep everything the same color. Okay, so now we're going to move to all our points that are related to 30 degrees. So here I really need to think about the fact that every single point on the unit circle, and you can go back to the last video to see why, is the cosine of the angle, comma, the sine of the angle. So one way we can remember this, it kind of looks like the word cousin, right, where cosine comes first and then sine, because sometimes people get those switched around. So if I'm working from 30 degrees, my cosine of 30, and this just comes from our little chart, okay? So I'm actually going to pause the video and write the chart here. So here's my little chart. Okay, I'm going to start out with 30 degrees. I have my sine and cosine values. I don't need tangent. I don't really need radians to look at here. So since x on the unit circle is cosine of theta, my x value for 30 is radical 3 over 2. And my y value, the sine value, is 1/2. So I'm actually going to finish all of those points that are red or related to 30 now. So every one of them is going to be exactly the same, except for one little thing that we talked about in the first lesson. So each of these, and I'll draw this on in a second, if we drew it, has the same triangle, right? If I drew angles for each of these, and really this angle over here is this whole way around, but what we're doing is we're using this triangle we would draw here to find our ratios. It's kind of like the trick with the unit circle. Okay, so here they're all the same, except here, when I'm in quadrant 2, when we wrote this, remember the very first day, this is a negative positive point, so I need to make the x value negative. Down here in quadrant 3, both values are negative. And then in quadrant 4, this is a positive negative forward and down. So just the y value is negative. Okay? So looking around here, I mean, that doesn't totally make sense for a triangle. Like, when do triangles have negative sides? But on the picture, thinking about points on the coordinate plane, it does make sense. So using the same type of logic, we're going to label our points for 45. Super easy because everything's the same. Right? Sine and cosine are both radical 2 over 2. Cosine goes first, sine goes second, but it doesn't really matter. So we'll just label these in. Okay, so all of those are done. So now we just need to think about our signs in relation to our positive and negative signs. So if I'm in the second quadrant, I want to make the x negative. Both are negative down here. And then in my fourth quadrant, just the y is negative. And hopefully you guys can see that. So the y is negative over there. Moving on to my 60s, right? We have cosine comes first. So these are going to be 1/2 radical 3 over 2 for all of those. So we'll go ahead and label those. So now we need to think about our positive and negative signs in each quadrant. So in the second quadrant, we have a negative x, both in quadrant 3, and then in quadrant 4, we just have a negative y. So in quadrant 4, I feel like these are hard to see. I'm actually going to make my negative signs in a different color, just so you can see that in this quadrant, all of the y's are negative. So just taking a look at this, a really nice way to think about this, I mean, I kind of labeled it with what's called reference angles. So like reference angles would be anything like the 150, 210, and 330 have 30 degrees as their reference angle. You can also go around the circle. So the way I would actually label this if I was doing this was I start with the y's and 0, and I go up 1, radical 2 over 2, radical 3 over 2, And this one up here, this is kind of extra information, is actually equal to radical 4 over 2. If you think about that, that reduces to 2 over 2, which is 1. Okay, and then I come down. 3, 2, 1, 0. And this all makes sense because, right, when I go around the circle, I'm going up. And then I'm coming down for my y's. Okay? And then when I go down here, right, I'm down to 0, and now we're going to go into the negatives. So negative 1/2, negative radical 2 over 2, negative radical 3 over 2, negative 1, and then we go back up, negative radical 3 over 2. So we're getting closer back to 0, negative radical 2 over 2, negative 1 over 2, and then back to 0. So the x's kind of work in the opposite direction, and I don't want to draw too much on here. Right, as I go around here for my x's, they start out larger and they're counting back. Right, so basically I end up with 1, radical 3 over 2, radical 2 over 2, 1 over 2, 0, and then they come back around down here, back to 1. Okay, so you can think directionally around the circle as well. So my suggestion is, if you had to use your homework page for this, to do the best you can, trace it, whatever, trace this circle and then do that for practice, because this is something, if we're in school and when we're back in school, we'll have a quiz and you do have to label everything, basically learning those patterns.